So, full disclaimer before I start this video, I do have a toddler who might be in the background as well as a cat. I'm so sorry for that. For this reaction video, I chose the article Shakespeare in the Bush by Laura Bohannan. I selected this article because it clearly demonstrates how worldview and cultural background influence how people interpret the meaning of stories and behavior. The article also challenged my assumptions about what is considered normal or universal across cultures. The main idea of Shakespeare in the Bush is that the meaning is shaped by culture and worldview that are not universally shared. In the article, Laura Bohannan, an anthropologist, shares her experience living among the Tiv people in West Africa. While staying with them, she decides to retell the story of Shakespeare's Hamlet, believing it would be universally understood story that would be interpreted the same way across cultures. However, as she retells the story, the Tiv elders repeatedly interrupt her to correct what they believe are misunderstandings. Instead of accepting her interpretation, they explain the events of Hamlet according to their own cultural beliefs, social structures, and values. By the end of the story, Bohannan realizes that what she assumed was a universal narrative is actually deeply rooted in Western worldview. This article strongly illustrates how worldview shapes the interpretation of cultural meanings. Bohannan interprets Hamlet through a Western lens that values individual choice, romantic love, and psychological motivation. In contrast, the Tiv people interpret the same events through a worldview that is focused on community, tradition, and spiritual beliefs. For example, the Tiv reject the idea of a ghost returning without witchcraft being involved. So they explain Hamlet's father's ghost as a result of sorcery. They also believe the remarriage is practical and necessary, so they see Gertrude's quick remarriage as logical rather than immoral. These differences show that people make sense of stories and behaviors based on their own cultural frameworks that are not shared universal meanings. One clear ethnocentric bias in the article is Bohannan's assumption that her interpretation of Hamlet is the correct one. At the beginning of the story, she believes the Tiv people naturally understand and agree with her version of the plot because she views Shakespeare as universally meaningful. Her Western worldview leads her to assume that the concepts like romantic love, betrayal, and individual revenge are understood the same way in all cultures. Although Bohannan becomes more aware that this bias as the story progresses, her initial attitude reflects ethnocentrism, the belief that one's own cultural perspectives is superior or standard. The story challenges the idea that cultures' values are normal or best by showing that the Tiv's interpretations are not wrong, they're just different. Their explanations are logical within their worldview, even though they are different from Western interpretations. This demonstrates that cultural norms are not universal truths. Instead, they are shaped by history, tradition, and social structure. The article makes it clear that assuming one's cultural values are superior limits true understanding. In my culture, a typical Mexican-American household, where independence is encouraged around the age of 18, but strong family ties are still very important. In my household, moving out at 18 was seen as normal and a step towards adulthood, which reflects heavily in the American cultural values of independence. However, An outsider from a more traditional Mexican background might see this as too fast or even irresponsible from their worldview. Staying at home longer reflects respect for family, emotional support, and financial stability. This shows the same behavior, moving out or staying home, can be interpreted very differently depending on the culture's values. The best practice for cross-cultural communication is the practice of active listening. Active listening involves fully focusing on the speaker, asking clarifying questions, and being open to meanings that may differ from one's assumptions. In cross-culture interactions, you good? This is especially important because people interpret world's behaviors and even stories through their own worldview. In Shakespeare in the Bush, Laura Bohannan initially fails to actively listen to the Tiv elders and assume her own interpretation of Hamlet is correct, and repeatedly tries to explain the story from her Western perspective. However, when she begins to listen to how the Tiv people interpret the story rather than correcting them, she gains a deeper understanding of how their cultural beliefs shape meaning. Their explanations of a ghost, marriage, and family roles reflect values that differ from her own, but are logical within their own worldview. This example shows how active listening allows individuals to move beyond assumptions and better understanding of cultural differences. By listening to understand rather than listening to respond, communicators can reduce misunderstandings and build a more meaningful cross-cultural interactions. My personal experience with cultural misunderstandings that involves comparing a traditional Mexican household to a Mexican American household. I originally assumed that they were very similar, but I later realized that assumption was incorrect. Through my experiences with my friends whose parents immigrated directly from Mexico, I noticed that in more traditional Mexican households, children, especially daughters and sometimes sons, often do not leave the home until they're engaged or married. This was different from my experience growing up in a Mexican-American household where moving out at 18 was encouraged. At first, I viewed this traditional approach as outdated, but I later understood it reflected a family-centered worldview that values commitment, stability, and support. This mirrors Bohannan's experience in this article, where different worldviews lead to different interpretations of what is considered appropriate or logical. The most significant lesson I gained from Shakespeare in the Bush is that worldview deeply shapes perception and meaning. What seems obvious, moral, or logical in one's culture may be interpreted completely different in another. The article reinforced the importance of active listening and intercultural communication. True understanding does not come from assuming others think the same way we do, but from active listening carefully to understand their perspectives and meanings. By active listening, we become more aware of how our own cultural experiences shape the way we interpret situations, which helps reduce misunderstandings and improve cross-cultural interactions.